Hello and welcome to episode 85 of Not Reserving Judgment, a podcast from the Canadian Constitution Foundation. I'm Josh Hawes, counsel with the CCF.
I'm Christine Van Geyn, the CCF's litigation director.
And I'm Joanna Barron, the CCF's executive director. And in today's episode, I'll walk you through some of the dubious arguments that the Crown's treaties with First Nations could prevent Alberta secession.
And I'll tell you about planned updates for privacy law in Canada and what we at the Canadian Constitution Foundation are working on the privacy front.
And we'll share our bad legal takes of the week, where we take a lighthearted look at some legal opinions that didn't quite land. But first, I'm going to explain why I've just sent off a letter to the Chief of Police in Kingston, Ontario, demanding that they stop violating people's rights by using drones hovering just outside of people's car windows at intersections to record what's going on inside. Yes, you heard me right. Police in Kingston decided to use a drone that they normally use for things like missing person investigations and accident reconstruction to spy on drivers inside their cars. To quote from their news release, the drone operator uses the zoom camera to record video while looking for cell phone use by drivers at these intersections. This resulted in 20 tickets in a single day for distracted driving against people using their phones to, change their music or change their map directions. And technically, that's illegal, although maybe not the most serious issue for many people. While doing so, they presumably violated the rights of not just those people who were, on their phones, but presumably hundreds of others. And police actually posted photos of this on Facebook, where you can see people inside their cars. You can see some of what's on their screen, the types of apps they might be looking at. And after police posted this online, it prompted a pretty big reaction. So you have a lot of people saying, oh, this is great, we're catching distracted drivers, but other people called it creepy. They said the police are being peeping Toms. They asked why police can't just stand on the corner rather than using the zoom lens mounted on a drone. And many people were asking, how is this legal? Well, the answer to that question is it's not legal. And the law would suggest police need to use a much less intrusive means if they want to tackle distracted driving. So there's no case law directly on point here, but I'm confident this is a violation of Section 8 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And I'm going to walk you through that legal analysis now. So first, some background. So Section 8 is the section that says everyone has a right to be secure against unreasonable searches and seizures. And the court said this is to protect a sphere of individual autonomy. So a place where people can, live, breathe, think, speak without the state and their goons breathing down the individual's neck. Alternatively, it's been described as a right to be let alone, and it has its roots in both the English common law and in the US Constitution. So the English common law said your home is your castle, so the king's messengers can't just intrude into your home without good reason. And in the US Fourth Amendment, which has very similar language, was created after colonial Americans got fed up with having their houses constantly searched by tax collectors who would just intrude without any specific warrant. And some scholars like to think of the purpose of Section 8 as existing to prevent the emergence of a surveillance state. So it's a way for individuals to retain some power and autonomy against a very powerful state. And I'm definitely one of the people that subscribes to that view. Justice Laforet, who wrote a lot of the big Section 8 decisions, was also of this view. And he was particularly concerned about technologies. I don't know if he predicted drones, but certainly video recording and things like that in the 1980s and 90s. And he said if we don't put guardrails on these types of things, we'll be left with no meaningful residuum of privacy at all. So that's why we have Section 8, and the reason, or the way that Section 8 prevents these things like the surveillance state and protects that right to be let alone is by requiring warrants whenever the state wants to search you. And so searches are presumptively illegal without warrants. There are some limited circumstances where warrants aren't needed, like when you're making an arrest, you can do a safety search for weapons, or if you hear somebody screaming inside a house, you could go in and find out if they need help. But in general, you need that warrant, or else it's going to be an unreasonable search and violate the Constitution. So let's apply the case law to this particular case. Whether Section 8 is violated in most cases is just going to come down to whether or not this was actually a warrantless search. And obviously there are no warrants here, so the question is whether this is a search. And I think that's pretty indisputable. So the court says searches are activities that interfere with a reasonable expectation of privacy. And to figure out whether that reasonable expectation of privacy exists, we first look at the subject matter of the search. And this isn't what the police were looking for. This is what the search is going to tend to reveal. So in this case, it's like all the information that this drone is recording about you inside your car, whether it's, just what you're doing in your car, what's inside, or what's on your phone screen in this case, which includes very private information, obviously. Think of the photos or the text messages or even the map directions on our phones. There has to be both a subjective and an objective expectation of privacy. Subjectively, I don't think that'll be hard. Most of us don't expect there to be drones just outside our car windows recording us. That's kind of like a creepy Black Mirror thing, not something we would expect. So the slightly harder question is whether it's objectively reasonable to expect privacy in this situation, and I'm pretty sure it is. So the court's been very clear that our expectations of privacy don't shrink just because new technologies make spying easier. In fact, our protections could become greater. And in the 2019 case RV Jarvis, where this creepy teacher had violated Section 8 rights of girls by using a pen camera to record them in the hallways of schools, the Supreme Court set out a non-exhaustive list of factors to use to consider whether there is a reasonable expectation of privacy when a recording is being made. So let's walk through those quickly. So you ask whether the person was recorded rather than just observed, because recording is far more intrusive, it's more permanent. And here, obviously, that's the case. Police say in their press release that they were recording. The second factor is location, and this one's interesting because you have less of a reasonable expectation of privacy when you're traveling down public highway compared to inside your home or your office. But the court makes clear in Jarvis that it's not enough to just say you're out in public, so you've lost that expectation of privacy. You obviously still have some expectation of privacy, even if it's diminished. And the example they actually gave in Jarvis was a drone that is taking pictures of people sunbathing at a public swimming pool. And in a lot of cases where there is no reasonable expectation of privacy found in people's cars, it's more about things like the speed of the car or the fact that it's like going down a particular street, and that is something that you've exposed to the public. It's a little different than what's actually inside your car or on your phone screen, right? The third factor is awareness or consent. Obviously, drivers weren't aware. This was just sprung on them. The fourth factor is the manner in which the observation or recording was done. More high-tech manners are more invasive. Obviously, this is as high-tech as it gets. The fifth factor is the subject matter of the recording. And like I said, this included what's on the phone screen, and that is some of the most private subject matter there is. The sixth factor is rules, regulations, or policies governing this. The police point to NAV Canada authorization to use the drone, but I don't think that applies to this particular case. Seventh factor is the purpose of the recording. And this is probably the best argument the police have because their purpose here is road safety. But I still don't think it's good enough. There's a Supreme Court case, for example, where a suspected serial murderer was tracked with a tracking device in his seat. And this was found to violate the reasonable expectation of privacy. That was like a specific suspect of a murder, right? It's like a serial killer. He did turn out to be a serial killer in the end. Whereas this is searching hundreds of people no one's actually suspected of anything, just to sort of do this dragnet and catch people who might be touching their phone at an intersection. So anyway, this is definitely a search. And then the question becomes whether it's reasonable. And like I said, if there's no warrant, it's presumptively unreasonable. And I won't walk through all of the jurisprudence on the exceptions to that. But suffice it to say, I really doubt this is one of those expectations or the situations where it would be found to be reasonable, even though there is no warrant. So I really want Kingston Police to stop doing this, and I think we'll probably pursue litigation if we have to in this case. Joanna, you were pretty shocked when you first heard about this happening. Are you surprised police are doing this, or what do you think?
Yeah, I'm a little surprised. I'm a little surprised at the sort of innovation, and I don't mean that in a good way, of the Kingston Police, although certainly I know police departments get creative and they tend to not really think through the charter implications. This made me think about, and yes, your analysis was very thorough, and I'm really interested to see. This is just such a fascinating issue, and it's so clearly um, foreshadows a lot of things where police are going to say, well, we have the technology, therefore we should use them. Like, we're entering an age where virtually everything that we do, think, or say can be surveilled pretty easily. And so Kingston Police seems to think that they're like overachieving with this without thinking through what the charter requires. But it made me think about some years ago, there was a billboard on the Gardiner in Toronto that said text and drive, and it was from Wathen Funeral Home, which is obviously a fake funeral home. And I think that this was paid for by like Toronto Public Health, and a kind of cheeky message that, like, yes, distracted driving does kill people and it's really, really bad. And I think it was actually like pretty visceral, and I would imagine fairly effective. But yeah, there's just like an instinctual reaction you have when I saw those pictures that the police service posted, where it's like you can literally see like somebody's texting, somebody has their Spotify app open. And needless to say, I'm, not incriminating myself here, but let's just say it's a little relatable, picking up your phone when you're at a red light. What do you think, Christine?
So it's really interesting because the whole thing, I think, in this case is going to come down to the question of reasonable expectation of privacy and whether or not you have a reasonable expectation of privacy that you won't have someone observing what you're holding in your lap while driving your car and at a red light. And I'm going to segue this into something that we're working on privacy, because a friend of ours, a friend of the podcast, a friend of the CCF, Professor Francois Tanguay-Renaud, has this whole idea about surveillance and reasonable expectations of privacy. And, if you're walking down the street and a police officer is following you, is that a violation of your reasonable expectation of privacy? If he's taking notes while you're walking, is that a violation? If he has a drone that's following you while you walk down the street, or if he has a swarm of drones monitoring everything that you do. The argument that Francois makes is that privacy rights is under protected in Canada and under recognized in Canada. And that not everything is properly captured, because intuitively, when we think of that type of conduct by police, it of course gives us the creeps in a much more troubling way than the Kingston drone example gives us. Although, when Professor Tanguay-Renaud gave that example of the swarm of drones following you while you walk down the street, I was like, you're, of course you can imagine it as a scenario, but it seems so unrealistic. But this is getting really, really close to what Kingston Police are now starting to actually do. When he gave me this original hypothetical over drinks a few months ago, I was like, that's a little out there. Police aren't going to be following people down the street with drones. But in Kingston, that's almost quite exactly what they're doing. So I want to talk a little bit about that and a little bit about privacy in Canada generally, and a new headline that we just got from Blacklock's, courtesy of the Federal Privacy Commissioner, Philippe Dufresne. Because yesterday he said that that this is a pivotal time for privacy and fundamental rights in Canada. And I agree. Many privacy experts have commented that our privacy legislation is outdated. The federal privacy legislation was actually drafted in the 2000s, and Ontario's in the 1980s. And obviously, there have been a lot of significant updates since then, like Josh's drones. So federally, there is the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, also known as PIPEDA, and that governs what we call data privacy, and it governs how private sector companies can collect, use, and disclose personal information. And it also contains various provisions that are used to facilitate the use of electronic documents. And it was passed in the year 2000 to promote consumer trust in electronic commerce. Now, there have been numerous calls for PIPEDA to be reformed and updated, for example, to address things like AI. And the Federal Privacy Commissioner in 2020 said PIPEDA was in dire need of reform because much has changed since it was enacted from a social, technological, and legal perspective. Now, keep in mind, November 2020 is when he said this, and that was in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, where I believe that all kinds of privacy violations were taking place. There's a whole chapter in the book that Joanna and I wrote dedicated to this, Pandemic Panic. For example, vaccine passports, there were the COVID snitch lines set up by the government. There was the disclosure of all kinds of banking information to a variety of institutions related to convoy protesters. Internal records show that police had compiled a blacklist that identified protesters by name, and it was distributed through then Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland to lobbyists, including the mutual fund dealers associations, as well as other institutions. And of course, during the pandemic, we know that the government was tracking and storing cell phone location data. And in the end, even though this was all uncovered, that they were, creating these heat maps of where people were located based on our cell phone data, in the end, privacy laws were likely not even violated by that surveillance program because of the inadequacy of our privacy legislation for the digital age. And so now Dufresne is saying it again. He's saying this is a pivotal time for privacy. Although, as Blacklock pointed out in their reporting, he makes no mention of his dismissal of hundreds of privacy complaints during the course of the pandemic, like those vaccine mandates that compelled Canadians to disclose their medical history as a condition of getting government services or even going to work. At the time, Dufresne, even though now he's saying this is such a pivotal time for privacy, back in 2020, he said all of these breaches of what I think were breaches of the Privacy Act were justified due to the urgency of limiting the virus, according to Dufresne. So where do things stand now? Well, in 2022, in response to all this criticism that our legislation's inadequate, the Trudeau government introduced Bill C-27, the Digital Charter Implementation Act, and that was aimed to modernize and update our privacy laws for, this digital era. And the bill proposed the replacement of PIPEDA with the Consumer Privacy Protection Act, along with the creation of a new administrative tribunal and regulations for AI systems. But Bill C-27 was not passed due to the prorogation. So I think we can expect to see something like C-27 reintroduced by the new Carney Liberal government. So when that's introduced, what should we be looking for? Well, if you want a good idea of some of the things that should govern how we think about privacy, I have a really special gift for you. It is a brand new online course that does a really deep dive into privacy, surveillance, and your fundamental rights. So this is at the ccf.ca/learn. We just launched it last week, and the course explains the concept of privacy as a fundamental right. It explains the legal framework for privacy rights. Then it does a deep dive into specific areas of privacy like bodily integrity and searches, territorial and spatial privacy, technology and privacy like AI and other new technological advances. it has that example that our friend Francois Tanguay-Renault gave about the reasonable expectation of privacy and that hypothetical of the drones following you. So it's really well tied into stuff that's happening actually on the ground in privacy right now. It's Tanguay-Renault gives one of the lectures. He gives the introductory lecture on the concept of privacy as a fundamental right, as well as some of the critiques of where the law currently stands. And it's also taught by a former provincial privacy commissioner, as well as lawyers who practice in that specialized field of surveillance and privacy. So if you want to be able to better advocate for your privacy rights and argue for stronger protections than we have right now, you really need a thorough understanding of those rights. And I think that this course, which is zero cost, will give you that understanding. So you can sign up at the ccf.ca/learn. And when you complete those 6 lectures, as well as the short quizzes that follow them, you get a certificate from Joanna at the CCF. So if you take the course, let us know on X or on whatever social media platform you use. We do a lot of work in a lot of different areas of fundamental freedoms at the CCF, and we're excited to sort of step into this realm of privacy because we've been taking on a lot more cases related to that right as well. Joanna, anything you want to say about the course? And maybe give people a sense of how hard the quizzes are. I know you might be an easier grader, and Josh, I think, is the tough one.
Yeah, I think you'll be okay. Just pay attention. Just, don't go on your phone while driving, while, watching the course. But no, the course is exceptional. Someone like Anne Kavukian, who is the former privacy commissioner for Ontario, and she's not just that, she's like an international pioneer in privacy law and standards. She has a concept called privacy by design that basically all new technologies, all new initiatives should be integrated with privacy protections from the first stage. And, I was at this Privacy Commission of Canada conference in Ottawa a couple of weeks ago, and her work is widely cited. And look, these issues, it's good to get a grasp, I would say, of the fundamentals, because things like AI are really going to challenge our conceptions of privacy, right? Because AI, basically large language models, aggregate and take all of our information in real time as we're giving it to them. There's not algorithmic transparency. So we could get into a situation where there's a claim of a breach of privacy, and it would be just a black box from the perspective of the court. So I think the answer is always to ground yourself in first principles. I also prepared the quiz for Professor Stephen Penny of University of Alberta's lecture, and it's excellent. It moves quite fast, but it's like he packs in pretty much like everything we need to know about Section 8 of the Charter in 20 minutes. It's brilliant. Anything to add on, Josh, or should we take a break?
I'll just say that the great thing about the privacy course is it gets into both the things like Pepito, which are protecting you from the private companies that are potentially violating your privacy and that we're handing way too much information over to, but also into the charter stuff, which is your protections against the government, against people like Kingston Police or Ottawa during the Freedom Convoy when they violated the privacy of many people by sending out a giant spreadsheet of names to all of these financial institutions, really outrageous behavior. So it covers the full gamut. So it's a really a great course. Let's take a break. And when we come back, Joanna, you can talk to us about the latest conversation in Alberta separation.
Okay, so there was a fascinating article by Jamie Sarkonak this week in the National Post that goes into a somewhat underexplored aspect of the legal and political tensions, which we know we've talked about a few times, are currently playing out in Alberta. And it raises some really interesting questions about sovereignty, self-determination, and how claims for secession, from what we know, are being adjudicated in Canada. So as we've discussed, I think a few times now, Premier of Alberta, Danielle Smith, has been making waves by amending laws which make it easier for citizens to arrange referendums. which is seen by some as courting the separatist or Wexit movement in the province. And this has triggered strong pushback from some Indigenous leaders who have argued that these sovereignty discussions violate their treaty rights. And they've made pretty bold claims about treaty authority and asserted that the numbered treaties are internationally binding agreements that supersede provincial authority, and that the treaty lands were never ceded nor surrendered. So essentially, to allow the premier of Alberta, to allow the legislature of Alberta to brook even a question of secession, is kind of vetoed by these overriding claims. And so Sarkonak, in her article, she challenges or assesses some of these assertions. She points out that treaty land is, by definition, actually ceded land. It is not unceded. It was surrendered in negotiation and in exchange for benefits from the Crown. And Sarkonak also critiques the claims that First Nations possess greater sovereignty than the provinces under Canadian constitutional law. But there's a lot of uncertainty, and she has some dialogue with Professor Dwight Newman, who is a CCF board member and who is also the national, if not international, expert in constitutional law and Indigenous rights. So when it comes to scenarios touching on secession, the truth is nobody knows exactly how treaty rights would be handled. We have, of course, and we talked about this, I think I talked about this last week, the Supreme Court of Canada's 1998 reference on Quebec separation, but it barely touched on Indigenous issues, maybe somewhat surprisingly, although the conversation has certainly evolved since then. And so we have this legal gap. So constitutional experts suggest that a separating province, even if it did successfully secede, would actually inherit treaty obligations. But the process itself would be messy, would be filled with legal challenges, and consultation with Indigenous peoples would be required, but outright consent to secession might not be legally mandatory. So Professor Newman said that the treaties would raise genuine issues. And he said, quote unquote, it would seem plausible that there could be a state succession to a treaty. People generally haven't suggested that Quebec would be incapable of separating due to treaties. And at a broad level, Alberta could likely take on the obligations associated with the treaties to ensure that they continue on. And he said, correctly, I think, I do see it as appropriate that Indigenous peoples are part of the conversations. But he said, as for the involvement of the federal government, Newman said that the duty to consult would be triggered when there is a decision under contemplation that would affect Indigenous rights. So early decisions, negotiations, stances. And he said obtaining actual consent from the First Nations would be ideal for separation, but there's little in law to say that it would be absolutely mandatory. And more broadly, I thought the article was interesting because it frames both the Alberta separatists and Indigenous sovereignty advocates or First Nations representatives as sharing certain tendencies to invoke international law selectively to support their positions, make expansive claims about territorial authority, and receive a certain degree of accommodation, whether from the federal government in Alberta's case or from the Alberta government in the First Nations case. So it's essentially a pretty fascinating clash between contrasting visions of political authority and self-determination. And it brings up the tensions within Canadian federalism and raises the question of who has ultimate sovereignty in a constitutional federation. So I think one thing is clear that bringing up, the UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, is certainly not a veto or a trump card. That seems clear. It would almost be like too cute, too neat for that to work. But it also seems like if this were actually to pass, which we all hope that it won't, Alberta and the federal government would have certain obligations vis-a-vis First Nations. Josh, I know you also noted this article by Jamie Sarkonak. Any other thoughts about it?
Yeah, I just think, you can basically only have one sovereign at the end of the day. So you can have, First Nations have certain rights, like they have rights to self-determination, for example. They have rights to, manage their own internal affairs, things like that. But there can really only be one sovereign at the end of the day, and it's really very, very clear to me that the sovereign in Canada is the crown, and so there may be this duty to consult, but there is no veto here. So that's like in a legal sense, I really can't see the treaty standing in a way. In a practical sense, maybe they could, right? Like maybe there would be sort of moral suasion of some sort that could be applied to the situation. So it would be very, very messy indeed. Christine, what do you think?
So we actually got some listener feedback on this issue of secession. And this is someone who listens to the podcast, and we've talked about this, all of this secession stuff in a few episodes now. And his comment was, I mean, of course, this is a legal podcast, so we talk about the law, but generally, when you think about how secession has happened in different parts of the world, secession is a rejection of the legitimacy of the state that you are leaving. So the place that, not that it's going to happen, not that any of this is realistic, I think, but if secession happens, it's because the place leaving rejects all of your legal arguments, all of your legal structures. And so all of this, in this listener's view, is kind of missing the practical point of what secession looks like. Yeah, there are legal and constitutional aspects at play from the state's perspective, but the state that is leaving rejects all of that. So what's the point of the analysis, was his comment. And I think, when you look at the history of where secession has actually happened in different parts of the world, it is not like using, except in, I think, the rare case, he gave an example of this rare situation in Czechoslovakia. In every other instance, it's just sort of a practical, we'll call it kind of military mechanism, rather than relying on these very nice legal arguments that we're all discussing here. So, I don't think any of this is realistic, but that was some listener feedback that I wanted to share because I thought it was a good practical point.
So my bad legal take goes to Calgary City Councillor Courtney Walcott, who introduced a motion to fight misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. I think most people know what misinformation and disinformation are, but malinformation, in case you don't know, is information that's true, but that's weaponized for ulterior purposes. So anyway, this counselor, he wants city staff to assess the quote role of the administration in identifying and correcting misinfo, disinfo, and malinfo, and educating the public on media literacy. He wants them to summarize key trends in misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, and to explore a reporting framework and retroactively look at misinformation, etc., from elected officials, members of the public, and community groups. So he wants city staff to, I guess, decide what's true and what's not, and ways to report that and punish that from fellow councillors and members of the public. And one of the reasons Mr. Walcott cites for this is that the Alberta government is planning to end municipal codes of conduct, something we've talked about in this podcast many, many times before. So, putting two and two together, Walcott is basically throwing a hissy fit because he won't be able to use the threat of codes of conduct proceedings to shut down the speech of his opponents, his fellow councillors, anymore. So he wants city staff to somehow do that instead. But codes of conduct are often unconstitutional limits on freedom of expression. And I think they would be in this case too. So the idea that you should be able to use codes of conduct to punish misinfo, disinfo, and malinfo, that's my bad legal take for this week. And just quickly before I pass it over to you, Christine, I just wanted to say how interesting it is that Alberta's planning to get rid of these municipal codes of conduct. This is in a bill called Bill 50, and it would basically nullify all the municipal codes of conduct that exist right now, and it would prevent municipal councils from creating new ones, but it would allow the minister to create new rules, including a new code of conduct. So there is a little bit of risk that this type of speech restricting code would come back. But in general, I think it's a good sign. We've seen these things weaponized to shut down speech, like John Robertson and PEI, who was punished for putting up a sign on his property that people didn't like, and all kinds of other situations, which we get into in our bad bylaws report upcoming in a couple of weeks. So just putting that out there, bad legal take that city staff in Calgary should be reporting on and punishing disinformation and malinformation, and good legal take from Alberta getting rid of codes of conduct. Christine, over to you.
Okay, so I want to give another shout out to a listener and friend of the CCF. This is Lyle Skinner, and he flagged this bad legal take for us this week. It's Bill 17. It's in Bill 17 in New Brunswick, which is it's an act respecting outlaw motorcycle gangs. And this bill is now before the New Brunswick legislature, and it contains, good public policy goals of reducing and deterring the presence of individuals who are in a gang from being in licensed liquor premises, so bars. But the bill restates a part of a clause that has existed in the original New Brunswick Liquor Control Act since 1963 that makes it illegal for a liquor license permit holder to allow swearing in their bar, restaurant, or any other place that serves liquor. So Clause 2 of Bill 17 modifies a regulation to create a new subsection. This is subsection 20 sub 1 that creates obligations on the holder of the liquor license to not permit disorderly, boisterous, or intoxicated persons to be in the licensed premises, permit the use of profane or vulgar language in the premises, or use profane or vulgar language in licensed premises. So a liquor license holder who is found in violation of this section can be charged a $500 fine on the first offense. So like the first F-bomb in the bar, I guess. And then $1,000 for the second F-bomb. And then depending on the context, they could even have their license suspended or canceled if there are repeated F-bombs. So of course you have a charter right to swear. And I mean, if you can't swear in a bar, where can you really swear? That is, the place I would expect you to be okay with swearing the most. Now, the goal of the legislation is obviously to prohibit conduct that could lead to worsening aggressive behavior in places where liquor is consumed. So, that's kind of captured by this boisterous activity, although I think that boisterous is quite a subjective criteria. And also, if you can't be boisterous in a bar, where can you be boisterous? But in any event, even if that is a legitimate goal, which I don't know if I concede, but let's say it is, even if it is a legitimate goal, the ban on swearing in bars is obviously not minimally impairing. Swearing does not lead to gang violence in bars, and it is likely unconstitutional. So New Brunswick, bad legal take and probably unconstitutional. You should change that before it passes. Joanna?
Okay, mine is a spicy one. So Parks Canada just banned non-Indigenous people from Long Beach in Tofino, British Columbia, more or less indefinitely, so that a whale who died can be honored, dissected, and ceremoniously harvested by Indigenous people only. Now, let's be clear, honoring dead whales is beautiful, and ceremonial practices deserve our respect. But this isn't about ceremony, it's about effectively state-enforced race-based exclusion, on public land, which raises a constitutional problem. So this is obviously a problem for Section 15.1, which mandates equality under the law. And there may be a justification under Section 15(2), which allows the state to take action sort of in affirmative action broadly. But let's look at how we would look at this under Section 1, because even if a law violates rights under the Charter, it still might be saved under Section 1 if it's a reasonable limit that is demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. But to do that, the government has to prove that the infringement is pressing and substantial, rationally connected to the objective, minimally impairing, and overall proportionate. So let's look at a few of these. So is it a pressing objective? Sure. Supporting Indigenous cultural practices, that's legitimate. Rational connection, closing the whole beach area to create space indefinitely for a private ceremony. I would say that'd be reasonable for a day or two, maybe, but that's not what's happening. Minimally impairing is where we get into some real problems because the closure is not narrow in scope, time, or application. It's not just for the ceremony or even a series of ceremonies. And Parks Canada could have closed the beach to everyone besides Indigenous people for the few hours of the ceremony. They could have restricted access just to around the actual whale. They could have created viewing areas at a respectful distance, but instead they created a blanket indefinite exclusion. And non-Indigenous Canadians, in fact, face fines for up to $25,000 just for walking on a public beach in a national park under federal law. So that's not reconciliation, that's effectively a type of segregation. So I think even if the intentions are good, intentions don't cure unconstitutional conduct. We've also seen a similar move in Joffrey Lake Provincial Park outside of Vancouver for a few months to allow Indigenous people to observe traditional practices. And yeah, I think this is a miss. Reconciliation is not about punishing people for who they are, but about building shared frameworks where everyone's rights can be respected. And Parks Canada, you missed the mark.
Bad legal take indeed. All right, that's the end of the show. So if you haven't already, please go and rate us, review us, and subscribe. And you can support our work by subscribing to the CCF's YouTube channel, by following us on X, or by visiting our website, ccf.ca, and signing up for our Freedom Update newsletter. The Canadian Constitution Foundation is a nonpartisan legal charity funded by your donations, so please do click that donate button on our website if you can. Thanks for listening.